Okay, so I'm recording this video because I'd like to share to you my presentation of the past project I did with Joost and with you guys, of course, in the past 6 months, and I'd like to present the results that I found. So I called the project Accelerating to Zero, and I think this covers the load. We'd like to get to zero by 2030. And that's quite a big challenge. So this is the way that I think that we should consider doing this or trying to do this. Let me start with the first law of sustainable energy. Any sane discussion of sustainable energy requires numbers. I'm gonna use a lot of numbers, and I hope this doesn't scare you off. But I think it's the way to get insights into the subject. So. That's what you can expect. Of course, we all know this picture. It's about 50% of current population living in cities, and by 2050 it's going to be about 2/3. So we've got a rising urbanization, and we can see it from outer space as well. So if we look at the Netherlands from outer space, we can clearly see that Amsterdam is such a bright spot as well. And the problem that we all face is that, well, if you look at the right of this image, you see that the atmosphere that we all live under is pretty thin, and actually the atmosphere that we really count as our atmosphere is even thinner. If you take a bowling ball and you paint some paint over it, the paint is about as thin as the atmosphere if you compare the Earth with the bowling ball. So it's really thin. And we're stuffing it with CO2, and that's the problem that we're getting. So that is where Amsterdam is, and let's zoom in. So this is where I did my internship. It's the Accenture building, and it's at Amsterdam Zuidoost. And if you zoom a bit out, a little bit further, and you look to the back, then there is Amsterdam Zuidoost. It's quite a big district, and if you zoom further in, we can see the Amsterdam Arena that we are all familiar with, Ziggo Dome, and if we go a bit further, we can see that there's a lot of residential area as well. So these residencies, they cover about 43% of total floor surface area. Then we've got the office buildings. These are a big player as well, 42% of total floor surface area. So these are the two main players. Then we've got a train track that crosses the district with a train station, goes all the way south, and it divides the district in two. So that is Amsterdam Zuidoost. And if we draw the border around it like this, we can see that it's 22 kilometers squared surface area. It's got 80,000 inhabitants. Energy demand annually is about 1,700 gigawatt hours. It's a similar result that Rudy and Rob got in their analysis. And we've got 260 million kilometers per year driven on roads. That is not in the energy demand yet, so it's even bigger. The total energy bill for the energy demand that I stated above is about 108 million euros a year. This excludes fuel for driving. So that's the collective energy bill, and this is the difference that people pay is estimated in this one as well. So Amsterdam has set very ambitious targets. We want to reduce by 2025. They want to reduce compared to 1990 levels with 75%, or 40%, and 2040 75%. If you translate this to current targets with the current emissions, we even need to go further. So current emissions are higher than by 1990. So nowadays we need to reduce it by 55% to 2025 and 81% by 2040. World Business Council Zero Emission Cities project has set even more ambitious targets. We want to reduce 100%. So let's get to zero emissions by 2030. And if you put it into perspective, it's actually really ambitious because based on spatial planning analysis, I concluded that by 2030 we can estimate that it's about 40% higher even, the emissions that we have. So we need to get down a lot. Roads to zero emissions requires a triple approach. So there's three things we can do about reducing emissions. There is the option to decrease production, energy efficiency, managing demand. We can produce more sustainably as well. So the energy that we need, we can produce with, for example, wind turbines and solar panels. And lastly, we can compensate elsewhere. So disregard the whole energy system and just invest in things beyond the district to take up CO2, for example. So let's start, right? This is an illustration that I'd like to present to you because it illustrates really that it's very important to look at the numbers. There's, for example, this option to electrify public buses. And although it's a very nice option because it's sort of economically viable, it only accounts for 0.03% of total reduction. So if you consider these measures to get to zero emissions, please guys, just look at the numbers and make sure that you invest in the right things. For example, the alderman of Amsterdam is really proud of this initiative that they are going to electrify all public buses in Amsterdam. And I would be proud as well because it is really nice to do, and there's more benefits to it. But make sure that you do know that it's not such a large project and having such impact as the alderman says. So actually, if you put it into perspective, we have a difficult time to illustrate large numbers. Also, we have a difficult time to find out, to really get a grips on small numbers. So it's actually there. That is the whole reduction potential of electrifying buses. It's actually quite logical because if you look at where the emissions come from in a district, you see that urban mobility is only accounting for 15%. The bulk of emissions lies in heating the buildings. And 1/3 of emissions comes from electricity. So let's make sure that we focus on the right things. I did an analysis what we can do. So this is a technical analysis. I looked at which measures are available and what if we apply them. So of course these are not all measures that are out there, but these are the main ones that I identified. First, we can heat our buildings more efficiently using, for example, heat pumps. Heat pumps are electrical devices that make sure that you heat the building with outside air, and you can gain sort of coefficients of performance over 300%. So you can heat a building with higher percentages than 100% actually. We can improve the insulation and glazing. That brings emissions down a lot. LED phase-in. So I say here heat pump phase-in and LED phase-in because this describes how you can install LEDs when the old lamps are refurbished. And with the heat pumps as well, it is assumed that we only install heat pumps when the gas boilers that are currently in place expire. Then we can restrict all vehicle access. It's not really a practical solution, but well, if you do it, you can get this amount of emission reduction. Wind turbines in designated areas is actually, it seems very small, but it's well, the Amsterdam was so kind to appoint a few areas in the districts that we can place wind turbines in, and in total you can place 26 turbines in there. And then you get this emission reduction in total. So PV panels on roofs, very small percentage. This is the situation if we put PV panels everywhere that we can logically and economically viably place them. It's so small because there's not a lot of roof space. We've got large apartment, flat buildings, office, high-story office buildings, and the roof space that is available, we cannot place everywhere the solar panels because, well, you have some shade in some certain spaces, and this reduces the potential even further. So it's quite disappointing, what I think, and maybe there's some analysis that are able to crank this up a little bit. But for my analysis based on the solar atlas, the zonatlas, this is the highest we can get. And then there remains a little bit that we should compensate elsewhere. So what does this all cost? It's a net present value spread out over various stakeholders that is a negative almost 400 million. And we need to pay an additional amount of 40 million a year from 2030 onwards to keep this system going. And it's actually quite disappointing. Investment costs are probably a lot higher than this as well. So, but this is the sort of net present value negative that you get when you have a look at all the economical gains that are out there achieved by this. Why is this so? Well, abatement costs, they vary greatly per measure. And we can see that on the left here, those are the most viable options. PV panels, LED lighting, heat pumps, and electrifying public buses is cost neutral. Then the first option that becomes economic, that costs a little bit, but not too much, is gold standard wind energy carbon credits. I say imports here between brackets because of course you never know where your energy comes from. So you might as well just invest in wind energy totally somewhere else and then you get carbon credits. It costs about $4.52 per ton of CO2 that you abate. And I draw up a scenario based on this one. So I implemented the viable measures first and then compensated with the cheapest compensation measures the rest. And what you get then is quite a better picture. You see a net present value of 160 million spread over all different stakeholders and additional costs from 2030 onwards of about 2 million a year. So if you would be able to harvest all this value in the right way, you would be theoretically be able to compensate emissions for the next 80 years. But what if stakeholders do not want to adopt these measures? Of course, this was an economical master plan from above, but we also have to deal with stakeholders that might not be willing to adopt it. So we need an economic and feasible approach to neutralize emissions. And I tried to identify a feasible approach by using two theories. The first one is this one. We all know probably the Rogers diffusion of the innovation theory, innovators, early adopters, etc. But in this theory, Rogers also described 5 properties of an innovation that you can use to see whether it is likely to be adopted by a population or not. And I used those, and this is another theory I used. It is the Van Geel's multi-level perspective, and it describes how there is a regime, and this regime wants to be in place, stay in place. It's the energy producers of today, the consumers of today, etc. And this regime, that it's constantly under influence of landscape changes, so for example climate change policy, energy prices, etc. And it's under attack from technological innovation from below. But it fends off these technological innovations fairly well because the regime is able to maintain its bonds and it stays in place. But sometimes when it's under too much stress, for example from the landscape, for example from policy, then a window of opportunity opens up and a technological niche is able to get itself in there and establish itself into the regime as a new technology. So the thing you want to do is you want to try to find where these weak spots are in the regime, where these weak links are. And if you can find them, you can exploit them. So I try to do this for Amsterdam Zuidoost and the new way of looking at energy. And I see that there is one obvious weak linkage. It's of course policy and markets versus industry. And in Amsterdam Zuidoost, this is really pronounced by the district heating network that is in place. It's a more efficient way according to the energy producer, but a lot more question marks are arising if this is really the case lately. And of course, you still emit fossils or CO2 in the process. So this is not a very sustainable way to do it. So there's a stress coming between policy, markets, and this industry. And another one I identified is the problem of greenwashing. Markets are constantly aware or continuously or increasingly aware that that they are being fooled. Momentarily, at this moment, Dutch people think that about 40% of their energy is sustainably produced, while it's only about 6%. And it will only take a matter of time until everybody finds this out, and you might want to be on the right place of the debate when this happens. So if you have an innovation that observably gets some real sustainable results, then you can exploit the weak link. So I did a multi-criteria decision analysis based on these factors, and I found that this is the most feasible approach to zero emissions. So it's quite sobering that we actually can only use a few measures and then have to compensate the rest. Net present value is still high though. But then I had to look at what happens if you take these likelihood of adoption criteria out and just focus on abatement costs and the weak links. Because I think this represents ZEC's ideological mission a bit more. It's a bit like, we don't really care that it is pretty hard to get it adopted, we just want to make it happen. We want to demonstrate that it's possible. So let's exploit these weak links in the regime, focus on costs because we want to do it economically, and let's see what comes out there. And then we get a different picture. We can see that almost all the measures can be implemented except for restricting vehicle access, compensating only 1/3, and net present value is still positive, but only by a slight bit. So it's really difficult to make this work because you do need to harvest all the economic gains that are out there, and they are divided over various stakeholders, so that's very difficult to do. Based on all these results, I'd like to recommend the following roadmap. Start with LED rooftop PV, because these are viable and these are well, very feasible as well. So start investing in those measures and first solidify your status as a player in the system as well, as you've been doing with the municipality of Amsterdam. Maybe find some coalitions with other parties as well that have the same interest. And conduct some further research into those heat pumps, because if you can make them work, they didn't show up at the feasible results, but if I did a sensitivity analysis and if you get them to be quite a little less complex, then you can make them work. So maybe there is some options for it, and if you have the options, you can reduce about 20% of total emissions by 2030. So they are really a good idea to have a look into. So this is what I recommend. And finally, with the if you still have some doubts about compensating elsewhere, actually, as greenhouse gas emissions are a global problem, there is no reason to prefer emission reduction in one place over another. But the punchline is, as long as it can reliably be accounted for. So the WBSCSD has co-developed the VCS voluntary carbon credit standard, and you might have a look at using those to compensate your emissions as well. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say, and have well, good luck with the project.